Let's see. That's pretty good, we think. Let's see who we blow out of the room. So this is a 6-part talk. Wow, that's a big gang. Thank you. To turn that down. I'll try to whisper. This is a 6-part talk, 6 weeks, based on strangers and friends. And it sounds like Norma got the bio that our silly website reverted to. That doesn't quite reflect the fact that the book is out. You can get it at Amazon or Barnes & Noble. You can't buy it in the city, unfortunately, because it's not serviced by Ingram, and Ingram has a lock on the book returns. It's serviced by Longleaf Publishers, and that's a lot better. Thank you. So, Strangers and Friends at the Welcome Table is a look into contemporary Christianities. I'm going to talk about Christianities, plural, in a moment. But it's based on teaching at the Divinity School and living almost all of my professional life in the South, even though I was raised in Michigan, and I had my dad was from Appalachia, and so we would go down and visit where his mother and father were, in a little brick town in a holler. His dad was a doctor, and we would get with our relatives for a week every summer, and we boys would just kind of absorb all the culture and religion and twangy accents we could, and we'd be, as children do, sort of picking up those accents and repeating them in the back of the station wagon on the ride up US 23 until my mom would say, "Knock it off. That's imitation, and that's not nice, boys." What did I learn from that? Well, every summer there was depending on what week we went, there would be a different revival tent set up. In this little town, there were 2 Methodist churches. One had been an EUB church, and one had been a Methodist Episcopal church. And they were right across the street from each other. And you would think that once they merged in 1968, they would merge that. But, of course, congregations, no matter how small, have their identities, and they couldn't even be served by the same pastor. I learned, that was amazing. The Baptists had the biggest church because they didn't split up like the Methodists, and the Wesleyans out on the main route into Portsmouth or Ironton. And to go to a Presbyterian or an Episcopal church, or even a Church of Christ, you had to go way into town. For Nazarene, or you could go to a Southern Baptist church in this small town of 1,000 people, but you could go to a Free Will Baptist church out on the state highway. And every summer, each of these churches would put up a revival tent for a week. And my vocational history was probably foretold when I asked my father, who was a minister, tent, right? You're a little kid. Can we go? And my father, who had sat through enough of those as a child, said, no. Which was very unusual for his character, because he was a nice person. He liked people. But he knew that once you were committed on a Monday night to a you were committed until Friday night. So I've always been sort of personally interested in religious difference, and this great religious difference right within 300 miles from where I grew up, where it began, where the upper South begins. And then, of course, you've got the middle South that we're in, and then, as Norma said, fate and luck would have it that I ended up at Columbia Theological Seminary, which is a Presbyterian seminary associated with the Old South. It's in Atlanta, but it's called Columbia Seminary because it was in Columbia, South Carolina, when South Carolina was the second wealthiest state in the country next to Connecticut. But of course, that was before the Civil War. And Columbia Seminary had to move to Atlanta and the New South even to keep its doors open in the 1920s. We went there in the 1990s, and I began to get a new education in what Southern Christianity was all about. So let me read a little bit from the introduction about how that works. As much as I thought I knew something about the upper rural South, I still had a lot to learn when in 1993 Columbia Theological Seminary in Decatur, Georgia, called on me to be dean of its faculty. Early on in my tenure, I again became somewhat bewildered student of Southern religion and culture when a colleague who hailed originally from Mississippi visited me and soon left me baffled. For a full 2 minutes, he proclaimed his close friendship with a person he'd gone to seminary with, including the detail that said person had been the best man at his wedding. He then stated, however, that he disagreed with what his friend has recently said in public regarding urban ministry. For a full 6 months after that, I was under the impression that our conversation had been all about how much my colleague loved and admired his seminary classmate. But a half year later, it occurred to me that all of his protestations of love and fealty were just so much boilerplate before the real message, that he sharply disagreed with his associate, and that I was to ignore everything up until the however. Not until 2 years into my Southern sojourn did I begin to get a proper feel for the common rhetoric of so-and-so is my closest friend and the dearest person in the world, and to realize that disagreement was being expressed within a larger pattern of Christian communal love and respect in a way that simply would not figure quite so large anyplace else in the country. And so it is with me as a historian of the varieties of Christianity in contemporary America in our southern region, which is home to over a third of Americans and is changing, but still has some of this character. There are some critical parts to this story I'm going to tell over 6 weeks, but it is a story I've come to, and people I've come to love and respect, and even today I'm going to tell you some things that may make you a little nervous, but they're all there. They're contending for a Christian voice, their own. Now, something about this region. It may surprise you that the South is as Christian as it is. But the American South, religiously defined, and I'll talk about that a little bit later, composed of the former states of the Confederacy, say minus Oklahoma and Texas, Texas because they're always telling us they are another country. And kind of they are, and I'll say why. If you think of from northern, lop off northern Virginia because it's much more complex than the rest of Virginia, and go down all along the East Coast to central Florida, about Orlando or I-4. Cut that off, and then go all the way over to the Texas border and up along parts of Arkansas, all of Arkansas and Louisiana and Missouri. That's the South culturally speaking, and along the Ohio River, where both sides of the Ohio River, you have people who talk the same way, who have the same variety of Protestant churches. If you look at all those counties, you'll see that in no one of those areas do Muslims, Mormons, Jews, or any other religious group besides Christian constitute more than 0.6% of the population. At the same time, every one of those states that I've just described has an anti-Sharia law, right? So we're simultaneously very Christian and worried about change. If you put, you've got something like 78 million people in those states, and 56,000 Muslims arrayed across that back. Now Muslims are concentrated in big cities, and they're satellites. Likewise, Mormons and Jews, largely clustered around cities, such as our own. But the panic is in the outlying area. And it's interesting to think what that might mean. So what will the 6 classes consist of? Today we're going to talk about hospitality, scarcity, and fear in Southern Christianity. The emotions, if you will, that bind us together and constitute some of our growing edge in this region. Then, for the next 2 sessions, we'll be looking at what I call Southern Traditions Revisited, how the lost cause, the memory of the Civil War and the loss and the reconstruction of that into a religion, if you will, is itself a kind of civil religion in the American South to this day. And then we'll look at, shorthand is called rattlesnake religion. There are very few serpent handlers, but everybody's sort of interested in them. And what they stand in for, in many ways, is the growing and very interesting body of Pentecostals and the growth of Pentecostalization, particularly in Black Baptist churches. Then we'll turn to some other perennials washed in the blood in the red states, how our faith, or the faith of Southerners, steps into the political environment in ways that it just doesn't in other places. California, Illinois, you keep that wrapped up a little tighter. Minnesota, you might let people know you're a Lutheran just as a civic kind of thing. Here, we wear it on our sleeves. And then Hurricane Katrina and responses to Hurricane Katrina as a particular instance of that. Then we'll turn to stuff that's kind of totally new in the South. If the first four topics are topics that we might have run into in 1968 in some form, there are some totally new things that are going on. Mega churches. We've always had big churches. Now we have mega churches. And the mega churches with no podiums and with huge auditoriums, with screens everywhere, are changing the way Southern Christians worship, even in little churches. I'll tell you about that later. And Southern Catholicism, which is a story of pockets in New Orleans and Charleston and small river towns that become bigger river towns like Nashville, is changing very rapidly with the influx of Hispanic Catholics. Then we'll learn about Christian homeschoolers, something many of you may not know much of at all. And Southern Christians who are LGBT and choosing to remain and not go away to other places like the traditional move of San Francisco or New York. Early moves to Atlanta are in the book, but we've got 700 to 800 churches in the South that specifically cater to LGBT persons who want to bond, don't want to leave their Christian faith, but don't want to be put down for being gay. And finally, we'll wrap it all up with how all of these Christians see themselves in together and conflictually. Okay, so that's the outline here. Why do I keep using this term Christianities? Because as a religious studies person, we can see that sometimes this Christian group and that Christian group do not recognize each other as such. And yet we can stand back and as intelligent people and say, uses the Bible, has a cross in their worship space, prays in the name of Jesus, baptizes people, does all of these other things, walks like a duck. It's Christian, right? But the fact that these side-by-side Christian experiences aren't in mutual recognition makes it both a contact sport, if you will, and so much more. So we're going to call it Christianities rather than talk about who's right and who's wrong. Secondly, I've already defined the South a little bit in terms of that map visually, lop off Nova, lop off the part of Florida that turns into New Yorkers who've come to get away from bad winters, and people from Central and Latin America who've come to Miami, the capital of Latin America, and define it as something other than culturally South. I'm going to show you a map in a minute to reinforce that in a different way. But this last term, a harmony of Christianities in the now South, tells us what's going on in this whole picture together. It's as though each of these Christian characters or groups, the LGBT Christians and Roy Moore and his 10 Commandments out in front of the Alabama Supreme Court, are in some great sing-off. They're all singing a hymn or a song that they believe is a Christian praise chorus. And it can sound like a cacophony, but I think of it more as a harmony. You just really have to listen to it to see it as the Christian thing in harmony. So if we look at this map and look to the red, and maybe let's start with gray and blue. What do you think that gray is? Mormon, yeah. The Intermountain West is, these are the dominant religious group in each U.S. county. Blue, what do you suppose that is? I hear somebody say Catholicism, Roman Catholicism? Yeah. Red is, you want to guess? Baptist, Southern Baptist. So another way to think of this, the South religiously defined, is as culturally Baptist. So, again, it's not just, look at Southern Illinois. Southern Illinois, the Southern Baptists go way up into, is dominant, well into the state, around Cairo and above. Missouri, Southern Baptists. Lots of Assemblies of God there too. Only once you get around St. Louis do the Catholics dominate again. And then we do have, of course, southern Louisiana and some other southern areas where the Catholics contend for space. But in, say, New Orleans, the number 2 group is Baptists, yes. So those of you who are like Episcopalians and Presbyterians, this is also home country for Episcopalians, Presbyterians, Methodists, but you're always number 2, number 3, number 4, Church of Christ, in those kinds of things. So a community that thinks of itself in Baptist terms thinks differently. It used to be that there was a strong association with separation of church and state. The same people would constitute a party, serve in public leadership, et cetera, but you wouldn't talk about it in church, right? You wouldn't talk about who you were voting for in church. All that's kind of changed, and it's one of the changing dynamics. But it's also how we constitute a region, religiously speaking, where the Baptists are strongest. And since the fundamentalist takeover of the Southern Baptist Convention, the conservative element of the Southern Baptist center of gravity has gone more conservative, and some other churches, African American churches in particular, have gone into more of a resistance move to that kind of party politics, which we saw just recently down in the Georgia Senate election, and before that we saw it in the Alabama Senate election.
What are the green boxes?
What are the these ones here? United Methodist. Yeah, it's a place where the Methodists are the most Methodists are fairly conservative in that area, and they got a really early start in Western Virginia, Eastern Pennsylvania, and what have you. And the brown dots are Lutherans, as you might expect. So, hospitality. Sharing at the table of plenty and sharing what little you have. The South is, as many of you know, if you've read some John Edgerton, I realize we can't see this, so let me read it to you. Christians in the South make of hospitality a central virtue, which they again express overwhelmingly through food. Okay? Why food? What do you know about the South for most people before the Civil War? Poor, slave ownership, a slave society. People who weren't slaves or slave owners were farmers, poor farmers, actually, on farmsteads. Everybody was living close to the land, whether you were in cotton or rice as a big producer dependent on enslaved labor, or eking out your corn and your other staples with pigs and a vegetable patch and what have you. And John Edgerton says that Southerners could get so much out of 3 ingredients and a long time in cooking because they had to. That the beautiful essence of Southern cuisine and things like pot liquor, you know what I'm talking about, where the greens or other vegetables go down, and you use it. You don't throw it out, but you use it with your cornbread and you make something beautiful out of it. Has everything to do with scarcity. Scarcity is a mentality that you don't get when you're living, I guess, in the Chesapeake Bay and at the same time, and there are so many oysters that they're piling up out of the bay at the same time. There's always enough to eat. So if you're in a rural area, and the South is the last to get proportionally to its population, railroads, good roads, education, a whole bunch of other connecting sorts of tissues. If that's true, then you're really dependent upon your neighbors. You know, if the man in the household or the woman in the household, the adults, get sick, you're dependent on the person at the next farm or house over. So food is a way, even though you don't have much food, food is a way of expressing love and concern. So it's not that people don't bring hot dishes when somebody dies in the Midwest. It has some of that same culture, but it's really amplified here. Likewise, family is extraordinarily important because they're the people who have to take you in, right? And people who break those kinds of implicit codes of I took care of you when you were sick, and now I'm sick. What's going on? There's a kind of moralism that gets going about the way other people are living or not living. Related to family is this whole matter of kinship. Anybody ever get asked, who are your people? Okay, what is what does the question, who are your people, mean? It means a lot, so let's throw out some things. Who's your family? What's your heritage? Where are you from?
How much money?
Yeah, there's implicit. Are you as good as we are?
Where do you go to church?
Where do you go to church? Yeah, I mean, this is as longtime dean at Vandy and at Columbia. I sometimes had to talk to new faculty about how, from the North, how where do you go to church was not a hostile question. It's like a really nice question, and if you don't have one already, the next question might be, would you like to come to our church? And it's not a bad thing. It's like the nicest thing somebody could say, because they're trying to a little bit become your people. Who are your people is an attempt to build a bridge or find out where you fit. There's a kind of stacked side to this. Are you good peoples, or are you, if you can, well, let me tell this next story, which is the Frank Harrington story. Frank Harrington was the pastor of the Peachtree Presbyterian Church in Atlanta. He took it when Buckhead was a declining neighborhood north of Midtown in Atlanta, and he grew it into a 10,000 member plus church. And Frank was as much a mayor of a small town as he was pastor. So he would find out, he knew everybody's name in this congregation and call him by name as he was walking around like a good mayor would do. And it always worked unless he misremembered your name from the very beginning. And instead of calling you David, he'd call you James, and you'd always be James. And you might have to switch churches, David, because you we're just tired of being called by the wrong name. And somebody actually told me that story. In any case, the real Frank Harrington story is the great biblical scholar Walter Brueggemann and Frank Harrington were supposed to co-teach a 90-minute session. And Frank Harrington used pretty much all his time going one by one, saying, now tell me who you are and where you go to church. And he worked the room as follows. And somebody would say, I go to South Springs Church. Oh, is your pastor so-and-so? And he worked it such that consciously or unconsciously, I think it was habit by this point, he knew your pastor, he knew your brother-in-law, he went to college with your sister, and so forth and so on. He had bridges to everybody in the room. And Brueggemann is thinking, man, he's wasting all his time. Guess who they liked better? So you can, if you find a bridge, you're strangers no more. And suddenly people who didn't know each other before are kind of connected. Has anybody had this experience? You know, of even moving within the South and meeting people, and suddenly you're connected. You were disconnected and now you're connected. I say in the book that if all the world were a Southern church environment, we wouldn't have needed Facebook. Would have been out of business, because we would have had, we would have known what so-and-so was doing, because we would have just had to ask somebody. Now, where that doesn't work is where there haven't been established patterns, and where we tend not to have relationships like this is across race. And that builds in spite of the fact that African Americans and white Americans and Hispanic Americans are overwhelmingly Christian in the South. There are these, apart from inside the Catholic Church, there are these separate communities that are the tragedy of American Christianity. Well, I said food is a way that we expressed in times of scarcity a kind of Christian love and care for one another, and it also has a dimension inside the life of the church. So dinner on the grounds, anybody know what that is? Okay, dinner on the grounds is particularly for churches that didn't just had a kind of a one-room church, a sanctuary. You have a big picnic outside. In the fellowship hall, post air conditioning south, it tends to move inside, but the feasts are huge. And it's an opportunity to feed one another and fellowship as a form of Christian community. And I have not found a church that doesn't do it. You know, from Greek Orthodox to on the most elaborated scale to Church of Christ, everybody feeds everybody as a form of fellowship. That and choirs of some sort, vocal music. Let me read something out of the book, though, that I particularly enjoy. Probably not going to find it here. It's a Baptist woman's ode to her Baptist roots. It's on a food blog. Well, let's keep going. Her point was that she associated as a little girl going to church in the morning and church at evening with a whole day-long experience of church food, snacks, Bible reading, back to church for youth group and more food, and then a prayer kind of service. Food was closely bonded in this. Katrina's story is as follows. One of my favorite television moments from the national media not getting Southern Christianity and folkways at all was when, you remember that the hurricane, actually, Katrina, came over southern Mississippi and Louisiana and crossed over, and then the damage was done. Electricity was out in a lot of places. And the CNN reporter of the day, a woman, was out looking for anything to report as aftermath. This is before the levee burst. And she happened upon a man in a Baptist, kind of suburban, low-slung church, setting out those long tables, just like that over there, actually a little bit longer, and grills and food and a big Gatorade thing. And she says, "What are you doing?" He looked at her like, I'm setting up to feed people. And she says, people, he says, people have lost electricity, they need something to eat. And she said, is this just for your church members? And he looked at her like, she was an idiot. And he said, no, it's for anyone who needs it. We're a church. It's what we do. Now, it is probably, Katrina may have been the finest hour for churches of all stripes in the American South's story for a long, long time. Because when the government failed and the insurance companies failed, the churches came through. And churches from other parts of the South and beyond came through as well. I mentioned scarcity before. One of the sort of tragedies of our American Southern story is we're still the most food insecure region, and it's not just because we're rural. You look, the least food insecure state is North Dakota. The density per square mile is so low out there. Why is that? Well, unlike the Swedes and the Norwegians and the Germans of the upper Midwest, we do not tax ourselves to pay for our poor citizens. Part of that's race, and part of that's feeling that the church will step up and take care of what needs to be done. And cultural Christianity becomes something of a moral stance. We're Matthew 25 Christians, and so we will feed people regionally. We'll feel obliged to have feeding ministries and prison ministries, and yet the region in which someone's church is most likely to have a prison ministry, or an individual Christian is most likely to actually visit people on death row or incarcerated long term, also has the highest rates of incarceration of the whole country. And Louisiana has the highest incarceration rate in the entire world. I mean, it makes you think that Matthew 25 is really works individually, but it doesn't scale up. So we have a low social safety net and a sense of what works inside our church should work inside our society. And I believe in what works inside our churches. I also am concerned. Now, so what is a genuine religious virtue? Feed the hungry, shelter the homeless, visit the prisoner, and so what have you. It scales up poorly as a whole society issue. This particular house here is Manna House in Memphis. It's a really interesting example of a ministry built on the Catholic worker model that isn't trying to solve everything. It's trying, much like Room in the Inn tries to do in the churches here in Nashville, it tries to solve tonight's problem. And in the case of Manna House, they give out shoes, they clean clothes, they give out a lot of socks, they do showers for men 2 days a week and showers for women 1 day a week, and a lot of food. And it's a pretty extraordinary kind of thing. Their welcome sign says, "Welcome, all sizes, all colors, all ages, all cultures, all sexes, all beliefs, all religions, all types, all people are safe here." And some of that means that sex workers and transgender people are made safe by these two Catholics who founded the thing, and people who came here mentally ill have found their way, just as they did at Charlie's Father Charlie Strobel's room in the inn here in Nashville, on a ladder up from life on the streets. The South has generated lots of responses to hunger. One, Society of St. Andrew, began in the 1980s during the Reagan era hunger crisis, works on gleaning. And a lot of commercial farming doesn't take all of the sweet potatoes and what have you out. So a lot of sweet potatoes that end up at places like the Martha O'Brien Center here in town and other places like that all over the South are gleaned by volunteers for the St. Andrew Society. Another really interesting group is Feed America First, which is an internal missionary group that's out of Murfreesboro, Tennessee. Murfreesboro, Tennessee is a big trucking hub. And the truckers' trucking interest and the canned food interests and the expired food interests got together to deal with the fact that while some people are working on hunger in the big cities, almost nobody was working on the little towns. The little towns in the hollowed out South, and you know where they are because they're the places where you still see a video store. It means they don't have broadband, right? Because broadband would run off the video store. And there's some extraordinarily heart-rending stories about children who see that truck pull up to a food bank. So the people in bigger cities are supplying the food banks, and the food banks are in turn feeding children, and a child will come in and say, "Oh, we'll eat today." Breaks your heart. Let me break this down a little more analytically. I found 3 models of hospitality to deal with the scarcity. There are these love and resistance models that seem to be set up in the face of things as they are. We're not satisfied with the things as they are. So one was Room in the Inn, where Father Strobel looks out and sees people on a very cold night in the parking lot of his church, sleeping in their cars, and he invites them in, and it balloons because sleeping in your car and having nothing to eat is no way to live, either as Christians with a warm place or as human beings in a cold place. Then there's Manna House, the place I told you about that is, it's called Manna House because the bread comes down every day from heaven, and we don't know why, it just does. Then there's Open Table Nashville, the place that is working on getting people who are chronically homeless into houses. you know, these are alternative economies created by people who are just dissatisfied with the world. Then there's a model that I call the gathered church that says, well, we need to provide a place for people who want to change. And a great example of this that is in the book is Jackson, Mississippi's Gateway Rescue Mission. A lot of rescue missions work this way, going back to the Depression of the 1930s. And they'll say, the executive director there wrote an essay, it's in the book, called Proper Charity. Proper charity is we will help those who can't help themselves, you know, people in wheelchairs and what have you, and we will help those who want to help themselves, who want to get clean, straight, sober, etc., turn their lives over to Jesus. And for those who don't want to change, we'll give them 3 nights and a meal each night to change their minds. And then that's it. Pretty hard, hard love, but it's kind of like, if you want inside the gathered church, that's the invitation. If you don't, if you want to live in the world, that's it. And then also in the book, there is the refuge, and this is most common with African American churches, and increasingly some Hispanic ministries. African American churches have been the sources of community development in places like South Memphis. They take care of their own, in part because no one else will take care of or thinks to take care of African American communities as opposed to individuals one at a time. And so the refuge is a place, as a model, where people of a particular association can go to be met with open arms. So the South is a place where we're divided sometimes by fear, in spite of the fact that, you know, the food side is the love side, the scarcity side comes out in fear, where around election time we can see just how badly we're divided when the map comes on TV at 11 o'clock, 10 o'clock news, sorry. And we can see how the counties divide up in the South. I'm going to stop with this story, however, because it's more transformative. It's a story of 2 churches in the time of Hurricane Katrina, and this picture is from East Biloxi, Mississippi, and the Missionary Baptist Church there. And this is from St. Charles Avenue Presbyterian Church. Yeah, that's pretty good timing. Is from, this church, and they both stood up in different ways. The Reverend Kenneth Haynes Church, Kenneth Haynes, now deceased, extraordinary man. He's a half-brother of a famous blues player, and rose through the ministry out of Mississippi, had a long, successful ministry in Los Angeles. He decided in the latter part of his life he wanted to come back to Mississippi, back to home, and on the night that Katrina hit, and you may or may not remember, the Mississippi coast, seashore coast, got hit by the wall of water. So in many ways, it got hit worse for a low-lying area, and they knew it was coming, and their church had two stories. The bottom story was like offices and Sunday school rooms. The second story was a sanctuary, a little bit bigger than this room. And he sent out his deacons to bang on people's doors and to compel them to come in from all over the neighborhood. And they carried grannies in from, who couldn't walk and what have you. With that night, and the water came up and kept coming up the stairs, and they're wondering, are we going to be trapped? They saved 300 people that way. And then for 3 months, with downed trees as their fuel and donations from that didn't come any closer than 3 miles away because of all the downed trees, and bringing in wheelbarrows and whatnot, they fed the neighborhood. I mean, this is like a kind of like what that Baptist man did the day after Katrina in Louisiana. It's what Christians do. It was transformative for the congregation, but it was a blessing again and again and again for East Biloxi. East Biloxi being a heavily impacted neighborhood. And it was infectious in this way. A lot of people who were off work then began off work because the Air Force Base or the schools were closed, began donating their time and providing the social infrastructure that FEMA wasn't coming in to provide. Something I like best about Christians in the South. Church works kind of expands. At St. Charles, they were flooded out, but they were on high ground. They couldn't get to the church, but the church was still there. And once they were able to come back in, they turned it as a site. They had a manse next door, big manse. They turned it into dormitories, and it became the basis for all those kinds of groups who wanted to come in from all over the country and overseas to build houses, to gut houses for 2 or 3 years, and then to build houses to this day. And they gave of their money to do other people's houses in the 9th Ward and 8th Ward and other low-lying areas, not right around the Pretty Garden District. What they experienced was more people joining their church than ever before because they were doing something more than the usual thing you expect from rich people in the Garden District. So I'll end there. That's an introduction to the complexity, if you will, of Southern Christians riven by fear and scarcity and nevertheless standing on your faith, not your fear, in the words of Reverend Kenneth Haynes. Questions? Yes.
Yeah, I attended the Methodist Church in Franklin for a time. Since it's down, and we had a local person who worked for the bishop's group, and she sent a survey about. The question more or less was how important is God in your life? Or does God guide your life? And it was less than 15%. Telling me God was important in their life, and I was just, it stunned me, considering how I've always seen it as the Bible Belt. Lack of that kind of view, and that.
Yeah. Well, it was Williamson County, right? He was part of a Methodist church in Franklin, which was experiencing membership decline pressures. Somebody from the bishop's office came in and presented a survey that said that when asked, how important is God in your life, 15% said, yes, God is important in my life. And it may have been a Richter scale, where it's most important in my life. But in any case, that seems to be at odds with traditional sorts of values. Two things. One is, and I commented back, it was Williamson County. My comment has to do with, one, Williamson County is our county with the highest in-migration in the state. You know, all those folks from the Midwest and from the West Coast and so forth. But that probably doesn't explain it all. The South is changing in terms of, I look at the room, you're as old and sometimes older than I am, and so we're talking about now the blue laws are gone, right? You can have soccer on Sunday. You can have soccer on Sunday morning. Travel soccer that takes people away and nobody bats an eye. Even in the South, we're becoming less religious. I don't know throughout it's 15% though. I'd like to ask that question in Dixon or Centerville or someplace like that. Yeah.
I think it's very interesting. You're talking about mega churches, and we all see that. But these churches are not mega churches.
No.
The churches that seem to be doing things are smaller groups of.
Although the most successful mega churches have lots of ministries that are parallel to some of the things we see here. So when we get to mega churches, I'll tell you about Jerry Falwell's old church, now run by one of his sons, that has a phenomenal ministry to men. There's one thing for men in recovery and another for women in recovery. And both of them are about the size of an average church. That is, the number of recovering addicts in each of those programs is about the size of a Southern church. That's so about 125 would constitute a congregation. And so we have lots and lots, tens of thousands of little churches, and then these punctuated 25,000 member churches. I give you an average number, but if we looked at a median number, we're under 100. And you say, well, it's like an albatross. That thing sure shouldn't be able to fly, except by virtue of the dedication of people who show up, give of their time, give of their money, and get something spiritual and material back from the experience. And if they ever stop getting something spiritual and material back from the experience, they fall to the 15% level, then things will change in a hurry. But yes?
You talked about the groups that are dissatisfied with the ways. I wanted to say something for Second Harvest Food Bank, which has worked in Nashville is better taken care of than it used to be, and they have moved out. Rural areas are very needy, and trucks and freezer trucks and everything that go out and take care of them.
Yeah, this, and again, this Second Harvest, if I'm correct, started during the food crisis of, was it the Reagan administration or was it during the Jimmy Carter sensitization? There are two big hunger awareness movements. But these people who get busy, and then it becomes a big enough thing to get serious about, are we helping all the right people, and they're asking the right questions, to take things to scale. I helped for a number of years with the Downtown Presbyterian Church Sunday morning feeding program, and we'd always take our youth there. And one of the things they required, and I thought this was pure genius, was the kids had to go serve the food with our guests, and then when the guests had all been served, the adults would clean up the back end so that the kids had to go out and sit down with homeless guests. And I thought, man, who thought of this? Because, it is so easy to turn this into an us-them situation, but once you start sharing stories across a table with food, you're doing something that was the basis for pretty much every religion on earth. And who better to experience that than children who haven't experienced that? Yeah,
That's why,
please.
this is a question. Is there a difference between urban and rural churches' experiences of growth? Because I grew up in a small town, and it's the Methodist church there is dying, and I'm just curious if there's a difference in how people view churches in a rural environment versus urban.
Yeah, America's story in the 20th century was going from a very, very rural America towards the cities at 1950, and then out towards the suburbs. But you still had substantial rural population because because there were ways to make a living in agriculture and in selling stuff to farmers and what have you. And as we have moved into these huge combines and other things that plant with a satellite and what have you, and 4 to 5 farmers share that on increasingly large plots. Those don't support families anymore, and consequently don't support towns. The economics of it have been the suburbs have become more part of the cities in the 21st century, and the rural areas have really hollowed out. And so the places where a lot of our traditional brand Protestant churches were located are drying up little by little. So that's a story. And the South, as a heavily committed to its small towns and county seats, is now feeling that more than we ever thought.
Is that exacerbated by a shortage of clergy as well?
It's exacerbated probably by a shortage of clergy who want to go to small towns. I speak as a theological educator who's like, there's this great church down in Columbia. Oh, I don't want to live in a rural area. It's not a rural area. It's a nice town. Go check it out. And but it's so far from Nashville. And that's kind of the attitude we get with our. Though those who will go find out otherwise. But there are, up on the Cumberland Plateau, there's not all of the churches I know, except for the Methodists, who send their people, are having a real hard time staffing. And I think I'm at time, but let's do this again in a week.